When a desperate farmer's wife's final attempt to secure a loan for their struggling family farm is coldly rejected, a shocking revelation about her husband's forgotten military medal leads to an unexpected visit from top Pentagon officials. Carrying classified documents, revealing a covert operation her husband unknowingly participated in decades ago, one that would not only save their farm, but expose a confidential military program involving experimental medical technology that could revolutionize trauma care for wounded soldiers worldwide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning mist clung to the rolling hills as Eleanor Parker parked her weathered pickup truck in the nearly empty lot of First Community Bank of Riverside. At 67, the resilient farmer's wife had spent almost 4 decades working alongside her husband James on their 180-acre family farm that his grandparents had established in 1923. Now, with foreclosure notices piling up on their kitchen table and barely enough in their checking account to cover next week's essentials, she faced the unthinkable, watching a century of family legacy disappear beneath corporate development. "Got all the paperwork, Mom?" asked Michelle, their 32-year-old daughter who had reluctantly left her position as a medical researcher at the university 6 months ago to help save the failing farm. Her return had brought innovative ideas and boundless energy, but they had come too late to reverse years of declining profits, mounting medical bills from James's worsening health condition after his military service, and the devastating drought that had ravaged their region for 3 consecutive growing seasons. Eleanor patted her worn leather satchel containing meticulously organized folders. "Everything's here, though I doubt it'll make much difference. Ms. Carlton has had her mind made up since we walked through the door last month. Bank manager Victoria Carlton had already rejected their loan application twice, despite the farm's unique history and the fact that James Parker was a decorated veteran who had served his country with distinction in his youth." The woman straightened, her shoulders as they pushed through the heavy glass doors of the modernized bank building. The original stone facade remained, but the interior had been transformed into a sleek corporate space that felt alien to Eleanor. The family-owned institution where her father-in-law had secured loans with a handshake had been acquired by National Financial Group 5 years earlier, bringing new policies that prioritized immediate returns over community relationships. "Mrs. Parker," called the receptionist, her voice professionally pleasant but detached. "Miss Carlton will see you now." She gestured toward the office at the end of the corridor where the bank manager waited, her expression already communicating the inevitable rejection. Eleanor and Michelle settled into uncomfortable chairs facing Carlton's imposing desk. The bank manager barely looked up from her computer screen as she began reviewing their application with practiced indifference. "Mrs. Parker, I've examined your proposal thoroughly, but I'm afraid the bank's position remains unchanged. Your property simply doesn't meet our current lending criteria." Carlton slid the application back across the desk, the red "denied" stamp painfully visible in the upper corner. The consistent negative cash flow over the past 4 years, combined with the drought forecast for the coming season, makes this an unacceptable risk for our institution. Eleanor leaned forward, her weathered hands steady despite the desperation she felt. "Miss Carlton, this isn't just about cash flow. This farm has been in my husband's family for generations. James served this country honorably for 12 years. Surely that counts for something." "I understand your attachment to the property," Carlton interrupted, her tone suggesting she understood nothing of the kind. "But national requires data-driven decisions, not emotional appeals or service history. The land itself is worth considerably more for development than agricultural use, particularly given its proximity to the proposed tech corridor." Michelle produced a folder from her bag. "We've secured preliminary commitments from 3 organic food distributors interested in our sustainable farming methods." She placed the letters on Carlton's desk. They're prepared to establish long-term contracts that would generate stable revenue within 14 months. Carlton glanced at the documents without picking them up. Future commercial agreements aren't sufficient collateral for a loan of this size, Dr. Parker. Besides, National has existing partnerships with industrial agriculture clients who have their own supply chain priorities. The implication hung in the air. Powerful interests preferred that the Parker farm be absorbed into corporate agricultural operations rather than remain independently managed. Eleanor had declined multiple buyout offers from AgriGlobal, offers that had become progressively less generous as their financial situation deteriorated. "We're only asking for enough to restructure our existing debt and update our equipment," Eleanor said, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "The farm has survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the farm crisis of the 1980s. Surely that demonstrates resilience worth supporting." Carlton closed the folder with finality. "Mrs. Parker, the banking landscape has changed. Historical performance isn't predictive in today's market models. Your property has been classified as high-risk agricultural land according to our environmental assessment metrics." She slid a business card across the desk. "I would strongly suggest you consider Horizon Development Group's standing offer before foreclosure proceedings advance further. They're prepared to close quickly, and their terms are more generous than you're likely to find elsewhere." Eleanor stared at the card without touching it. Horizon Development, the same company that had transformed 4 neighboring family farms into a sprawling technology campus that now dominated the valley's western approach. The same company whose water usage had further depleted the region's struggling aquifer, accelerating the environmental challenges facing remaining agricultural operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. FHTRDF Gert Kef Gert Jeff Dirt Tier Tiert 100 years of family history, Eleanor said quietly. "My husband's military service, his grandfather's legacy as one of the first sustainable farmers in this county, all to be bulldozed for another office park." Carlton's expression revealed momentary discomfort before her professional mask returned. "I understand this is difficult, but my hands are tied by institutional policies. Perhaps some portion of the land could be preserved as a memorial garden. At least that aspect of your family's legacy might continue." As they left the bank, Eleanor's normally composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine despair. The impending loss wasn't just financial. It represented the erasure of generations of agricultural knowledge and family history painstakingly preserved by the Parkers. "We still have options, Mom," Michelle said as they walked toward the truck, though her tone lacked conviction. They had already explored every conventional financing avenue, reaching identical dead ends. Their last hope had been Carlton, who had known Eleanor and James for decades before the bank's acquisition. Eleanor nodded absently, her gaze drawn to a black government vehicle with military plates parked across the street. 2 people in uniform watched them with unusual interest, speaking into their communication devices as Eleanor and Michelle approached their truck. "Military personnel?" Michelle whispered, following her mother's gaze. "What would they want in Riverside?" Eleanor shrugged, too preoccupied with their financial crisis to wonder about military business in their small rural community. As they drove back toward the farm, neither noticed the government vehicle pull out behind them, maintaining a discreet distance as they wound through the country roads. The Parker family farm spread across rolling hills that had once been considered marginal land when James's grandfather had purchased it for a pittance in 1923. What the property lacked in premium soil, it made up for in natural springs, varied elevations, and natural windbreaks that created perfect conditions for the sustainable farming methods the family had pioneered decades before. Organic became a marketing term. Eleanor parked near the century-old barn that housed their equipment and workshop. Despite financial constraints, the building was meticulously maintained. Its sturdy beams and weathered siding, a testament to generations of careful stewardship. "I didn't want to say anything at the bank," Michelle began as they walked toward the farmhouse, "but I received a strange call last night from someone at Walter Reed Medical Center. They were asking very specific questions about Dad's military service in Southeast Asia, particularly about the injury he sustained and the experimental treatment he received." Eleanor stopped walking. "What kind of questions?" "Technical ones. Details about his recovery timeline, lasting effects, genetic markers they tested for after the procedure. The caller knew details about Dad's case that aren't in any public record. Before I could ask why they were interested after all these years, they said they'd call back." Before Eleanor could respond, the distant sound of helicopter rotors drew their attention to the horizon. A military helicopter approached from the east, banking sharply as it reached the farm's perimeter. "What in the world?" Eleanor muttered, shading her eyes against the morning sun. The helicopter circled once before landing in the fallow field beyond the equipment barn. Moments later, the distinctive sound of a motorcade reached them, multiple vehicles approaching rapidly along the private farm road that connected to the county highway. "Mom, those are military vehicles," Michelle gasped as the lead vehicles came into view. The black SUVs with government plates formed a protective perimeter, personnel emerging with practiced efficiency to secure the area. Behind them, a distinctive vehicle with flags on the front fenders rolled to a stop in front of the weathered farmhouse. Eleanor Parker, who had faced drought, flood, and financial ruin with quiet dignity, found herself momentarily speechless as the Secretary of Defense stepped from the armored vehicle and approached them with purposeful strides. "Mrs. Parker," called Secretary William Richards, extending his hand with genuine respect. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but matters of national security sometimes require discretion. The medal your husband received after his service in Southeast Asia is connected to a classified program that has remained confidential for decades. We have much to discuss." As military personnel established a security perimeter around the farm, Eleanor and Michelle exchanged bewildered glances. The farmer's wife, who had left the bank defeated and hopeless just an hour earlier, now found herself welcoming one of the most powerful officials in the country onto the land her family had nurtured for generations. What Eleanor couldn't possibly know as she led the government entourage toward her modest farmhouse was that her husband's military service and the experimental medical treatment he had received after being wounded had become critically important to a classified defense initiative that would transform military medicine worldwide. The farmer's wife, denied a simple bank loan that morning, was about to learn that her family's connection to military history had produced something far more valuable than she had ever imagined, a medical breakthrough that could save countless lives on and off the battlefield. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, where 4 generations of Parkers had gathered around the same maple table, Eleanor and Michelle found themselves seated with Secretary Richards and 3 individuals introduced as the Surgeon General, the Director of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the Chief of Experimental Medicine at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. "Mrs. Parker," the Secretary began once everyone was settled, "I understand you met with your bank this morning regarding foreclosure proceedings. I assure you, by the time our conversation concludes, those financial concerns will be addressed. But first, we need to discuss something of far greater significance." He nodded to an aide who placed a secure tablet on the table, displaying classified medical data and images. What you're seeing is confidential research that began 40 years ago during your husband's military service, the secretary continued. James was one of 7 soldiers who received an experimental regenerative treatment after suffering severe trauma in combat. What no one could have predicted was how his unique genetic response would provide the key to solving problems that have plagued military medicine for decades. Dr. Catherine Chen, the director of DARPA, leaned forward. Mrs. Parker, for the past 40 years, a classified program called Operation Phoenix, has been quietly monitoring and studying the long-term effects of that experimental treatment. Your husband's case has been of particular interest due to his remarkable recovery and the unique cellular adaptations we've documented. Eleanor's expression revealed growing confusion. If James's case is so valuable, why has every VA hospital pushed him towards standard treatments for years? Why have his ongoing health issues from his service been systematically minimized by the military healthcare system? The secretary exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. A fair question that deserves a candid answer. Policy fragmentation between administrations led to contradictory approaches. While some agencies recognize the value of your husband's case, others prioritize standardization of treatment protocols across the system. Surgeon General Dr. Marcus Williams added, "The classified nature of Operation Phoenix meant that public military healthcare couldn't openly prioritize special monitoring without revealing security concerns about the experimental treatment. It created a destructive disconnection between public healthcare policy and classified research planning." Eleanor processed this information slowly, decades of frustration giving way to disbelief. So while official policy pushed veterans like James to the brink financially with inadequate care, a secret program was documenting the value of what was happening in his body. "Unfortunately, yes," the secretary acknowledged. "This administration is working to reconcile these contradictions, but we're racing against accelerating threats to our military personnel worldwide." Which brings us to the immediate matter, your husband's Silver Star Medal and the microfilament embedded within it. Dr. Chen activated a secure presentation on the tablet. "Our analysis suggests that specific cellular markers in your husband's blood work could be crucial for developing regenerative therapies for traumatic injuries. Unlike standard treatments that require consistent protocols and pharmaceutical interventions, your husband's body has demonstrated remarkable adaptability to trauma and stress over decades." Michelle studied the technical data with her researcher's eye. "These are regeneration rates far more significant than anything currently public. You're tracking cellular restoration capabilities well beyond what mainstream medical science acknowledges." "Correct," confirmed Dr. Eliza Johnson, Chief of Experimental Medicine. "Public projections remain conservative to avoid speculation, but our classified models indicate more rapid applications of this technology than previously thought possible. We are particularly interested in how your husband's cells achieve this regeneration without the side effects or cancer risks that have plagued similar research, something corporate medical programs haven't accomplished despite billions in funding." Eleanor sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the surreal contrast between the morning's bank rejection and the current conversation. "All this interest is flattering, but it doesn't change the fact that we're weeks away from losing everything to foreclosure. Horizon Development has already surveyed the property for their technology campus." Secretary Richards smiled for the first time. "That's actually not accurate, Mrs. Parker. As of this morning, Horizon Development's permits have been suspended pending national security review, and National Bank is currently responding to a federal banking examination focused on potential improper relationships between lending officers and development interests with foreign connections." The secretary slid a folder across the table. This contains a formal offer from the Department of Defense to establish your farm as the cornerstone of a new rehabilitation center for wounded warriors, incorporating innovative agricultural therapy with cutting-edge regenerative medicine research. Full ownership would remain with your family, with substantial federal funding for expanded operations. In exchange, you'd provide research access and collaborate on development of therapeutic approaches based on your husband's unique case. Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning terms that would not only eliminate their debt, but provide generational security for the farm's continued operation under family control. The financial figures made her recent loan request seem trivial by comparison. "Why now?" she asked, looking directly at the secretary. "If you've known about James's condition for decades, why wait until we're on the brink of losing everything?" Dr. Johnson answered with unexpected candor. "Bureaucratic failure, Mrs. Parker. Operation Phoenix was compartmentalized across multiple agencies, creating information silos. Your farm's foreclosure status was flagged in our system just 1 week ago, when cross-referencing revealed the potential loss of access to your husband's ongoing case data, classified as critical to national security. The system failed you," the secretary acknowledged, "and many others like you. Part of our mission now is correcting that failure before we lose irreplaceable medical research opportunities. Your husband's sacrifice and subsequent recovery preserved something precious when government policies actively worked against you. We are here to ensure that wisdom isn't lost." As the meeting continued into the afternoon, Eleanor and Michelle learned the true scope of what was being proposed. The Parker family farm would become the administrative hub for a nationwide network of agricultural therapy centers for veterans, with advanced research facilities constructed on the property and educational programs established to train a new generation in both sustainable farming techniques and regenerative medicine approaches. While government vehicles continued arriving throughout the day, bringing equipment and personnel to secure the property, Eleanor walked alone to the small rise where James was resting in their bedroom, unaware of the extraordinary developments unfolding on their property. Standing in the doorway, watching her husband sleep, his Silver Star medal displayed on the bedside table, she tried to process the day's remarkable reversal of fortune. "You were right all along," Eleanor whispered to her sleeping husband. "You always said your service would mean something someday, that the pain you endured wasn't without purpose." She gently touched the medal that, unknown to them, contained microscopic medical data that had been monitoring his condition for decades. "I almost failed you, almost lost everything you and your family built." As sunset painted the rolling hills in golden light, Eleanor returned to the kitchen, where Michelle was reviewing contract details with government attorneys. The farmhouse now functioned as an impromptu command center with secure communications, equipment established, and security personnel positioned throughout the property. "Is this really happening, Mom?" Michelle asked quietly when they finally had a moment alone. "After years of rejection and struggle, suddenly Dad's military service is vital to national security." Eleanor nodded, still processing the whirlwind transformation. "Apparently it's been important all along. The government just couldn't tell us without revealing classified medical research." She gazed out the window at the military vehicles and helicopter on her property. Quite a change from being denied a simple bank loan this morning. What Eleanor Parker couldn't know as she signed the historic partnership agreement that evening was that her husband's decades of quietly enduring the after-effects of experimental treatment would soon be recognized as one of the most significant contributions to military medicine in American history. The farmer's wife, who had entered the bank defeated and emerged to find the Secretary of Defense on her property, was about to become the unlikely catalyst for a fundamental reconsideration of how the nation approaches veteran care and medical research. The farm that had faced imminent foreclosure would instead become the cornerstone of a new national initiative connecting traditional healing with cutting-edge science. All because one family had stubbornly persevered through hardship, when surrender seemed the only path forward. As security teams established overnight positions around the Parker farm, protecting the veteran whose cellular structure was suddenly classified as a strategic national resource, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that her family's legacy would now continue for generations to come, transformed from a struggling farm into a place of healing and hope for wounded warriors following in her husband's footsteps. The following morning dawned with an unprecedented scene at Parker Family Farm. Military personnel patrolling the perimeter, satellite communications equipment established on the south lawn, and a helicopter maintaining position overhead. For the local residents of Riverside who drove past, the sudden government presence at a struggling farm sparked intense curiosity and speculation. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching as medical researchers carefully collected samples from James, who was now awake and bewildered by the extraordinary developments. Each test was being documented, photographed, and secured in specialized containers for analysis at federal research facilities. Mrs. Parker called Dr. Johnson, entering the kitchen with a tablet displaying real-time security footage. "We've identified several vehicles conducting surveillance of your property from the county road, local news vans, but also representatives from Horizon Development and National Bank." Eleanor nodded without surprise. Word travels fast in small communities. By noon, half the county will know something extraordinary is happening here, even if they don't understand what or why. Secretary Richards had departed late the previous night after establishing a comprehensive security protocol for the farm and its invaluable resident. The operation now unfolding was led by Dr. Johnson, whose team worked with practiced efficiency despite the program's recent formal establishment. "Mom!" Michelle burst through the door, her expression animated with excitement. "You need to see this!" She led Eleanor to the main living room, where government technicians had set up advanced imaging equipment to analyze James's cellular structure without invasive procedures. On high-resolution screens, the unique regenerative properties of his tissues appeared in extraordinary detail, revealing characteristics that had remained hidden for decades. Side-by-side comparisons with standard human tissue highlighted dramatic differences in cellular repair mechanisms, inflammation response, and resilience under stress conditions. "Your husband's response to the experimental treatment created something remarkable," explained Dr. Lisa Morgan, the team's lead geneticist. "This isn't just accelerated healing, it's a fundamentally different approach to cellular regeneration. The body anticipates damage rather than simply responding to it." Eleanor studied the images with growing amazement. James always said he could feel something different happening inside him after the treatment, that his body seemed to know what to do before injuries fully manifested. "We thought it was just a veteran's intuition." "Not intuition at all," Dr. Morgan replied. "He was recognizing something science is only beginning to understand, the body's ability to modify cellular expression in anticipation of trauma. The experimental treatment somehow accelerated and directed this capability, achieving results that billion-dollar corporate labs haven't matched with advanced genetic engineering." As Eleanor absorbed this information, Dr. Johnson approached with a satellite phone. "Mrs. Parker, we've intercepted communications indicating that Horizon Development executives are meeting with their attorneys to challenge our presence here. They're claiming their development agreement gives them legal priority over federal intervention." Eleanor's momentary elation faded. "They've invested millions in planning their technology campus. They won't walk away without a fight. Which is precisely why we need to understand exactly what happened with your bank loan applications," Dr. Johnson replied. The timing and circumstances suggest potential impropriety that goes beyond normal business practices. Would you be willing to review the full history with our financial investigators over the next several hours? Eleanor and Michelle meticulously reconstructed 6 years of increasingly desperate financial maneuvers to save the farm. Loan applications with contradictory rejections, land value assessments that inexplicably decreased for loan purposes, but increased for tax valuations, and Horizon Development's progressively aggressive acquisition attempts that always seemed synchronized with bank decisions. The pattern is unmistakable, concluded Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the Treasury Department, investigator assigned to the case. National systematically undermined your financing options while simultaneously facilitating Horizon's acquisition strategy. The question is whether this represents standard predatory business practice or something more concerning. Eleanor spread decades of financial records across the dining room table. Everything changed 2 years ago when we declined Horizon's first purchase offer. Before that, our relationship with the bank was challenging but functional. After we refused to sell, even modest operational loans became impossible to secure. Agent Torres nodded thoughtfully. Coincidentally, 2 years ago is when Horizon Development received its first major contract for technology centers supporting military communication systems. Projects requiring extensive security clearances and background checks. She tapped notes into her secure tablet. I need to cross-reference some information with our national security database. As she stepped outside to make secure calls, Michelle turned to her mother. Do you think there's actually a connection between Dad's medical case and Horizon's sudden interest in our specific property? They could build their campus anywhere in the county. Before Eleanor could respond, commotion at the farm's entrance gate drew their attention. Several black SUVs had arrived, but unlike the government vehicles already present, these carried corporate logos. Victoria Carlton from National Bank emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by William Horizon himself, the rarely seen founder of Horizon Development. Dr. Johnson intercepted the visitors at the security perimeter, their conversation visible but not audible from the farmhouse. The discussion quickly grew animated, with Horizon gesturing emphatically toward the farm buildings, while Carlton repeatedly consulted documents from her briefcase. After several tense minutes, the corporate representatives returned to their vehicles and departed, Horizon's expression visibly thunderous, even from a distance. Dr. Johnson walked briskly back to the farmhouse, her typically composed demeanor showing signs of concern. That was illuminating, she reported as she joined Eleanor and Michelle. Mr. Horizon presented what he claims is an executed purchase agreement for your property, signed 4 days ago and notarized by a bank employee. According to this document, you accepted their final offer and agreed to vacate within 30 days. Eleanor stood abruptly. That's absolutely false. We never signed anything. Obviously, Dr. Johnson agreed. The document is a crude forgery that wouldn't withstand basic forensic examination. What's interesting is their willingness to present it to federal officials, suggesting either extraordinary arrogance or genuine panic. Agent Torres returned from her secure call, her expression grave. We have a situation that extends well beyond predatory lending. Horizon Development's recent technology centers contain sophisticated biomedical research sections that don't appear in any official blueprints, sections with specifications remarkably similar to cellular regeneration research requirements. The implications settled heavily in the room. You're suggesting they wanted our farm specifically to access James? Michelle asked incredulously. Not just access, eliminate competition, Agent Torres clarified. Our working theory is that Horizon recognized the strategic value of your husband's unique cellular structure before most of the medical sector. They've been systematically acquiring properties with connections to veterans from the same experimental program, incorporating the research potential into their own proprietary laboratories, then eliminating the original sources through development. Eleanor sank back into her chair, the full picture finally becoming clear. The tech corridor announcement that devalued our property for agricultural use, but made it perfect for their campus, that was never coincidental, was it? Preliminary evidence suggests the routing was influenced by Horizon's connections within the State Transportation Department, Agent Torres confirmed. Creating economic pressure on precisely targeted properties appears to be their established pattern. As this revelation settled, a secure video call from Washington interrupted their discussion. Secretary Richards appeared on screen, flanked by his national security team and the Attorney General. "Mrs. Parker," the secretary began, "we've uncovered disturbing information about Horizon Development's operations. Their interest in your property wasn't simply opportunistic, it was part of a coordinated strategy to privatize crucial medical research ahead of projected defense needs. The Attorney General has authorized immediate action to secure all evidence and prevent any potential destruction of records." On the Secretary's command, a coordinated operation launched across multiple states, federal agents simultaneously, serving warrants at Horizon Development headquarters, national banks' corporate offices, and several state transportation departments where routing decisions had suspiciously aligned with Horizon's acquisition targets. This extends beyond corporate overreach into potential national security concerns, the Secretary continued. Foreign investment in Horizon Development suggests the possible transfer of strategic medical research to overseas entities not aligned with American interests. We believe your husband's case may have inadvertently disrupted a systematic effort to monopolize regenerative medicine breakthroughs that could transform battlefield survival rates. As Eleanor listened to the Secretary outline the expanding investigation, the day's revelations aligned into a coherent but disturbing picture. Her family's stubborn preservation of their farm and James's quiet endurance of his post-treatment condition, often dismissed as foolish sentimentality and unnecessary suffering, had positioned them at the center of an emerging geopolitical struggle over the future of military medicine. By mid-afternoon, the farm had transformed into an operations center for what the Secretary had classified as Operation Healing Trust. Military transport planes landed on the straight section of county highway that ran alongside the property, bringing specialized equipment and additional personnel to secure and analyze James's unique medical case. Amid this controlled chaos, Eleanor sought a moment of solitude in the small office adjacent to their bedroom. The room remained much as James had designed it when he returned from service, walls lined with photographs and mementos from his military career alongside books on healing and recovery that documented his personal journey. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines of these irreplaceable volumes, understanding now that they contained something far more valuable than personal history. These meticulously maintained journals detailed a 4-decade-long experiment in human resilience, conducted without sophisticated equipment or corporate funding, just patient observation and intimate knowledge of his body's response to the experimental treatment. A gentle knock interrupted her reflections. Dr. Johnson entered carrying a weathered metal box that Eleanor immediately recognized from their early marriage. "We found this hidden beneath the floorboards in James's workshop," she explained, placing it carefully on the desk. "It was so well concealed our scanning equipment almost missed it." The box bore James's military insignia and the date 1982, the year of his experimental treatment. Eleanor opened it with reverent care, revealing dozens of medical records, each labeled in James's precise handwriting with dates and observations that spanned decades. "My God," Eleanor whispered. James was documenting everything from the beginning: symptoms, recovery patterns, anomalies in his healing process. He kept all of this hidden, even from me. Beneath the medical records lay a leather-bound journal, different from the others, its pages filled with correspondence between James and other veterans who had received the experimental treatment, many from different military branches and units. Dr. Johnson nodded solemnly. Your husband appears to have participated in an unofficial support network that transcended military boundaries to preserve data about their shared experience during times when the official program was dormant. These letters reference an after-effect brotherhood involving participants from all 7 original treatment recipients, all working to document their unique healing capabilities. The revelation added profound new dimensions to Eleanor's understanding of her husband's journey. What she had preserved as family tradition had actually been part of a far larger mission, one that James had kept secret, even from his wife. There's a more, Dr. Johnson continued, revealing a sealed envelope addressed to those who follow in James's handwriting. With trembling fingers, Eleanor broke the wax seal that had remained untouched for years. The letter inside began with words that sent chills through Eleanor's body. If you are reading this, the truth about our treatment has finally been recognized. The cellular changes we experienced represent humanity's best hope for survival in an increasingly dangerous world. Eleanor read the letter aloud, her voice growing stronger with each prescient paragraph. James had documented early regenerative research that wouldn't become mainstream science for decades, connecting with forward-thinking medical professionals worldwide who recognized the potential long before public awareness emerged. The letter concluded, politics and profit will inevitably complicate humanity's response to this discovery. Nations and corporations will seek to control regenerative medicine resources. Our mission transcends these boundaries. We are not merely preserving medical anomalies. We are preserving possibility itself. The cellular adaptations contained in our humble bodies may determine whether future generations face unnecessary suffering or unprecedented healing. As Eleanor finished reading, the farmhouse erupted with activity. Agent Torres burst into the room, her expression urgent. We've just received intelligence that Horizon Development has initiated document destruction protocols at 4 locations. The Attorney General has authorized immediate raids to secure evidence. Simultaneously, Dr. Morgan arrived with preliminary genetic analysis results. Mrs. Parker, your husband's cellular structure contains adaptive traits we've never documented in any research subject. Early projections suggest it could maintain 85% regenerative capability under conditions that would cause complete cellular collapse in standard tissues. If these results hold true across multiple systems, your husband's case may represent the most important medical resource in the country for trauma treatment. The convergence of past and present, James's hidden documentation, and the modern medical crisis created a moment of profound clarity for Eleanor. Her family hadn't simply been stubborn farmers clinging to outdated methods. They had been custodians of a mission spanning decades, preserving biological resources whose true value would only become apparent when the world most desperately needed them. As evening approached, Secretary Richards reconnected via secure video, his expression simultaneously grave and determined. Mrs. Parker, today's developments have elevated Operation Healing Trust to our highest national security priority. The attempted corporate capture of regenerative medicine breakthroughs represents a threat to military readiness that transcends normal economic competition. The Secretary outlined immediate actions, emergency protective status for all remaining veterans from the experimental program nationwide, a comprehensive audit of medical research that had already been privatized, and the establishment of a National Regenerative Medicine Security Initiative with the Parker Farm as its centerpiece. We've operated on the naive assumption that market forces would naturally preserve essential medical discoveries, the Secretary acknowledged. That assumption has nearly cost us the very resources we'll need to save countless lives in future conflicts. Your husband's preservation work, once dismissed as paranoid record-keeping, now represents a cornerstone of national medical resilience strategy. As the video conference concluded, Eleanor stepped onto the porch where her family had gathered for generations to watch the sunset over their fields. The farm that had appeared worthless to bankers and valuable only for development to corporations now buzzed with activity as scientists, security personnel, and government officials worked urgently to document and protect its true treasure. The remarkable human being who had quietly carried an extraordinary gift within his cells for 40 years. Michelle joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Pretty dramatic reversal from this morning's bank rejection," she observed with understated humor. "Yesterday we couldn't get a simple operating loan. Today the Secretary of Defense calls Dad's condition vital to national security." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Your father always said that value and price rarely align in times of confusion. The market completely mispriced what we have here because it was measuring against the wrong time frame." As darkness settled over the farm, the full security perimeter became visible. Floodlights illuminating the fence line, guards at regular intervals, and surveillance drones maintaining constant aerial observation. The measures seemed surreal, surrounding a humble family farm that had nearly been foreclosed upon that very morning. What Eleanor Parker couldn't fully comprehend as she surveyed this extraordinary transformation was how her husband's decades of quiet documentation would soon be recognized as one of the most significant contributions to military medicine in modern history. The farmer's wife, denied a simple bank loan that morning, was now at the center of a national security operation that would fundamentally reshape how civilization approached trauma care and healing. The medical case that financial institutions had deemed worthless would soon be recognized as priceless, an irreplaceable biological resource developed through decades of careful adaptation that could make the difference between life and death for countless wounded warriors in the increasingly unstable decades ahead, all because one family had stubbornly preserved their heritage when every economic incentive pushed towards surrender. As Eleanor prepared to review security protocols with Dr. Johnson, her phone rang with a local number she immediately recognized: Victoria Carlton from National Bank, the same woman who had denied her loan application hours earlier. "Mrs. Parker," Carlton began, her typically confident voice now uncharacteristically hesitant. "In light of new information, the bank would like to reconsider your loan application. We believe there may have been irregularities in our initial assessment of your property's value and the viability of your operation." Eleanor listened silently, allowing the banker's uncomfortable backpedaling to unfold without interruption. "We are prepared to offer highly favorable terms," Carlton continued when met with silence. "The regional president is personally reviewing your file and believes your family's service to this country represents exactly the kind of commitment our institution was founded to support." After a measured pause, Eleanor responded with the quiet dignity that had carried her through decades of struggle. "Ms. Carlton, I appreciate your reconsideration. However, it appears my farm's financial situation has resolved itself through other channels. Please direct any further communications to the Treasury Department investigators who will be auditing your loan decision processes tomorrow morning." As she ended the call, Eleanor exchanged knowing glances with Michelle. The bank's sudden reversal couldn't have been more transparent. a desperate attempt to distance itself from Horizon Development's increasingly suspicious activities now that federal investigations had begun. Funny how quickly our unacceptable risk profile improved once the Secretary of Defense showed up, Michelle observed dryly. Eleanor nodded, gazing out at the fields her family had tended for generations. Markets are remarkably efficient at recalculating value once all information becomes visible. We were never poor risks, just rich in resources the financial world wasn't measuring yet. The farmer's wife, who had walked into a bank defeated that morning and emerged to find military vehicles on her property, was beginning to understand that her family's stubborn preservation of their farm would soon be recognized not as quaint tradition, but as visionary foresight that might help secure humanity's medical future in increasingly uncertain times. As Eleanor finally made her way to their bedroom, she found James sitting up, reviewing the documentation the medical team had shared with him about his own cellular structure. The confusion and bewilderment from earlier had given way to a quiet understanding. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Eleanor asked gently, sitting beside him on the bed. "That's why you kept all those records hidden away." James nodded slowly, his weathered hands tracing the images of his own remarkable cells. "I felt the difference from the moment I received the treatment. The doctors at the time told us it was experimental, that they didn't know what the long-term effects might be. But within months, I knew something profound had changed." He looked up at her, eyes reflecting decades of silent knowledge. "Remember that time I cut my hand fixing the tractor, and you wanted to take me to the hospital for stitches? I refused, because I could feel it already knitting itself together from the inside. I couldn't explain how I knew. I just did." Eleanor remembered dozens of similar incidents over the years, injuries that should have been debilitating but weren't, illnesses that passed through him with unusual speed, the remarkable stamina that had allowed him to work the farm well past when most men his age had retired. "Why didn't you tell me about the Brotherhood?" she asked, indicating the journals and correspondence they had discovered. James sighed deeply. "At first, it was classified. We were sworn to secrecy about the treatment. Later, when the program went dormant and the government seemed to lose interest in us, we decided to document everything ourselves. We were afraid that if we talked too openly, someone would try to exploit what had happened to us before the world was ready to use it." Wisely, his foresight had been remarkably accurate, as Horizon Development's attempted acquisition had proven. The wisdom of ordinary people, so often dismissed by institutions of power, had preserved a medical miracle until humanity had the ethical framework to utilize it properly. As James drifted off to sleep, Eleanor sat beside him, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, each breath moving through a body that had quietly carried extraordinary potential for decades. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more security, more revelations about the full scope of what the experimental treatment had created. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their farmhouse bedroom, Eleanor finally understood the true legacy of her husband's service, not just to his country, but to humanity's future. Outside their window, the farm that had nearly slipped from their grasp now hummed with the activity of people who recognized its true value. The legacy that financial institutions had deemed worthless would become the foundation for healing, that transcended national boundaries and economic metrics, all because a wounded soldier had the wisdom to document his journey, and his wife had the determination to preserve their home against all odds. 3 days after the Secretary of Defense's unexpected arrival at Parker family farm, the property had transformed beyond recognition. Military-grade security fencing now surrounded the perimeter, advanced medical research equipment filled the barn, and a temporary command center occupied what had once been the family's dining room. Government vehicles continuously arrived and departed, bringing specialists from disciplines ranging from cellular biology to national security. Eleanor stood in the center of their apple orchard, the same orchard that had been marked for bulldozing by Horizon Development, watching as teams of scientists carefully collected soil and water samples, documenting the environmental conditions that had surrounded James for decades after his treatment. His weathered journal lay open in her hands, the prescient observations from 1986 providing uncanny context for the modern crisis unfolding around them. "Mrs. Parker," called Dr. Morgan, the lead geneticist, hurrying across the orchard with tablet in hand. "We've completed the first comprehensive analysis of your husband's cellular regeneration mechanisms. The results are, well, revolutionary isn't an exaggeration." She displayed complex genetic sequencing data alongside comparative charts, showing healing thresholds for standard human tissues versus James's enhanced cells. The differences weren't incremental, they were transformative. "Your husband's body contains genetic adaptations we've never documented in medical literature," Dr. Morgan explained, her professional composure barely containing her excitement. "Under simulated conditions, representing catastrophic battlefield. Udroma, standard human tissue, fails completely, while his maintains nearly 85% regenerative capacity. The implications for trauma medicine are staggering." Eleanor studied the data with growing amazement. James would document changes in his healing patterns after different types of injuries, tracking how his body seemed to learn from each experience. He called it remembering the blueprint of how his tissues were supposed to be arranged. "That remembering created something remarkable," Dr. Morgan replied. "Your husband essentially documented cellular intelligence decades before modern science recognized the concept. What's most extraordinary is that his body achieved this while maintaining normal immune function. Corporate research programs have consistently triggered autoimmune responses when attempting similar regenerative capabilities." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a government helicopter. Dr. Johnson emerged accompanied by Attorney General Elaine Harmon, whose presence signaled the escalating seriousness of the investigation into Horizon Development and National Bank. "Mrs. Parker," the Attorney General greeted her with a firm handshake, "we've uncovered evidence that transforms our understanding of what's been happening with your husband's case and others like it. I believe you deserve to hear this directly." In the farmhouse kitchen, now functioning as a secure briefing room, the Attorney General spread documents across the table where 4 generations of the Parker family had shared meals. The papers revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Horizon Development isn't simply a real estate company with predatory practices, Attorney General Harmon began. Evidence seized from their headquarters reveals it's a front for Nexus Biomedical Holdings, a conglomerate controlled by foreign interests, systematically acquiring properties connected to experimental medical treatments from the Cold War era. She displayed internal corporate documents outlining Operation Harvest, a global strategy to identify, acquire, and control medical anomalies that showed promise for regenerative medicine applications. They specifically targeted veterans who had received experimental treatments and their families, the Attorney General continued. Their acquisition pattern precisely tracks properties connected to the 7 original recipients of the treatment. Your husband received. Once acquired, the individuals were transferred to private research facilities, and their original properties were converted to commercial use, effectively erasing the connection to the experimental program. And Eleanor's expression darkened as the implications became clear. They weren't just after our land. They wanted to erase the evidence that this regenerative capability existed independently before they claimed to have developed it themselves. "Precisely," confirmed the Attorney General. We've discovered patent applications filed by Nexus subsidiaries for cellular regeneration techniques nearly identical to those naturally occurring in your husband's tissue. They were positioning to control regenerative medicine through intellectual property rights, creating a monopoly on trauma treatment in increasingly unstable global conditions. Dr. Johnson added, National Bank wasn't simply making poor lending decisions. Their loan officers received specific direction to accelerate foreclosures on targeted properties, while simultaneously facilitating Horizon's acquisitions. The coordination was systematic and deliberate. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of corporate espionage, regulatory capture, and strategic elimination of medical research that might challenge emerging patent monopolies. Horizon Development had constructed its technology centers not primarily for communication systems, but to house state-of-the-art biomedical research facilities where appropriated genetic resources could be studied and eventually commercialized under proprietary control. The most alarming aspect, Dr. Johnson noted, is how close they came to succeeding. Of the 7 veterans who received the experimental treatment, your husband is one of only 2 who haven't already been acquired by Horizon subsidiaries. The unique regenerative capabilities developed through decades of adaptation were being systematically privatized without public awareness. As Eleanor absorbed these revelations, Michelle entered with urgent news. The preliminary injunction against Horizon has been granted. Federal marshals are securing all their research facilities nationwide, and their assets have been frozen pending investigation. The Attorney General nodded with grim satisfaction. We've also detained William Horizon and 4 National Bank executives on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft of strategic national resources. The investigation continues to expand as we follow financial connections to overseas entities. Eleanor walked to the window, gazing across fields her family had stewarded for generations. All those years we struggled to keep this place going, watching James endure ridicule from doctors who dismissed his unique healing as impossible. We never imagined we were targets in a global resource grab. Few people recognized what was at stake, Dr. Johnson said quietly. Cellular regeneration developed through natural adaptation represents perhaps the most valuable medical resource of our time, more precious than pharmaceutical patents. As global conflicts become increasingly deadly and traumatic injuries more common, the farmhouse door opened as Secretary Richards arrived for a scheduled briefing, his expression resolute as he surveyed the gathered experts and the evidence spread across the table. Mrs. Parker, he began, I've just come from an emergency National Security Council meeting. Based on evidence secured over the past 72 hours, I've authorized the establishment of the National Regenerative Medicine Research Center, with your farm designated as its first protected site. He handed Eleanor an executive order bearing the presidential seal. This classification places your property and your husband's medical case under permanent federal protection while maintaining your family's ownership and management rights. Additionally, I've directed the establishment of a national fund to identify and recover remaining veterans from the experimental program before more irreplaceable genetic adaptations are lost. The Secretary continued, addressing the broader implications. What began as an investigation into predatory lending has uncovered a coordinated attempt to monopolize the biological foundation of trauma medicine. The natural adaptations your husband documented through decades of careful observation represent a national treasure that transcends normal economic valuation. Eleanor studied the executive order with mixed emotions. Pride in her husband's contributions, grief for the veterans already lost to corporate acquisition, and determination that James's remarkable cellular structure would benefit humanity rather than enrich corporations. "Mr. Secretary," she said finally, "James's journals document correspondence with other veterans who received the experimental treatment. Some of those connections might still exist, even if the individuals themselves have been acquired by Horizon. Perhaps there's still a chance to recover their unique adaptations." The secretary nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need your husband's help identifying potential sources. Every adaptation preserved represents healing potential we cannot afford to lose." He turned to his advisors. "I want a comprehensive national inventory of regenerative adaptations, prioritizing veterans with documented experimental treatments. We're in a race against time as global conflicts escalate." As the strategy session continued, Michelle quietly led Eleanor to the barn, where government scientists were analyzing James's blood samples using advanced technology that could map genetic potential without invasive procedures. "Mom," she said, pointing to a digital display showing three-dimensional renderings of cellular structures. "Look what they found in Dad's bone marrow. A regenerative sequence that enables rapid tissue reconstruction after catastrophic trauma. This adaptation doesn't exist in standard human physiology because modern medicine relies on external interventions rather than internal recovery processes." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. That ability developed after the hunting accident in 1994, when the doctor said he'd never walk normally again. James spent months focusing on what he called remembering wholeness, visualizing his leg returning to its proper function. Within a year, you couldn't tell he'd been injured. "A natural adaptation process," Michelle marveled. "No genetic engineering, no laboratories, just patient observation and self-directed healing over decades." "Your father called it listening to what the body knows," Eleanor explained. "He said anyone could overcome minor injuries. The true test was developing regenerative capabilities for when conventional medicine had no answers." The wisdom of that approach was now validated by advanced scientific analysis. James's unique cellular structure represented a living library of regenerative adaptations developed through decades of careful documentation that modern technology could identify but had largely failed to replicate. By evening, the preliminary national inventory had identified 23 remaining individuals nationwide who potentially contained unique regenerative adaptations from various experimental programs. Most were like James, aging veterans struggling with medical systems that dismissed their unusual healing capabilities as impossible or fraudulent. Secretary Richards authorized immediate protective orders for all identified individuals along with emergency medical support to prevent any further acquisition by corporate interests. Teams of medical historians began combing military records to identify veterans who had participated in experimental treatments before being acquired by corporate entities, hoping to recover cellular adaptations that might still exist in stored tissue samples or DNA records. "This is rapidly becoming the largest medical preservation initiative in history," Dr. Johnson noted as they reviewed the expanding operation from the farmhouse command center. "All because a wounded soldier refused to surrender his unique healing capacity despite institutional skepticism." "We were fortunate," Eleanor acknowledged. "If our bank appointment had been scheduled a week later, or if your analysts hadn't flagged our property in time, James would have been in a Horizon research facility by now, and everything he documented would have been lost." The sobering reality of how closely they had come to losing invaluable medical knowledge hung heavily in the room. For every James Parker identified and protected, how many similar cases had already been lost to corporate acquisition, forced relocation, or simple abandonment as veterans struggled to navigate medical systems that rejected their extraordinary capabilities? As midnight approached, Eleanor sat alone on the porch, reflecting on the extraordinary developments of the past 3 days. The farm that had seemed worthless to financial institutions now hosted round-the-clock security, protecting what the secretary had declared strategic national resources essential to future battlefield medicine. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. "May I join you?" Secretary Richards asked, having stepped away from the ongoing strategy session inside. Eleanor nodded, gesturing to the adjacent rocking chair where generations of her family had watched sunsets over their fields. The secretary settled into it with a weary sigh, momentarily just another human being carrying impossible responsibilities rather than one of the most powerful leaders in the country. "Mrs. Parker," he began after a comfortable silence, "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing what your husband preserved. How many other essential medical breakthroughs have we already lost without recognizing their value until too late?" Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. James used to say that wisdom often looks like delusion until circumstances change enough to reveal its value. For decades, his careful documentation seemed like the obsession of a man who couldn't let go of his military experience, yet he persisted. "Why?" the secretary asked simply. "Because he knew something valuable would be lost if he surrendered to conventional medical wisdom," Eleanor replied. "Not just cellular regeneration, but knowledge. The embedded wisdom of the body finding its way back to wholeness. The subtle relationship between mind, spirit, and physical healing that can't be reduced to standardized protocols." The secretary nodded, his gaze traveling across the darkened fields now illuminated by security floodlights. Modern systems excel at measuring immediate value, but often fail to recognize resilience value, the capacity to recover from unexpected trauma. Like keeping detailed records of healing that seemed impossible by medical standards, Eleanor suggested. "Exactly," the secretary agreed. "Society has systematically dismissed anomalous healing as anecdotal or impossible, creating brittle medical frameworks that maximize standardization under ideal conditions but lack adaptive capacity when conventional approaches fail." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Johnson, who approached with urgent news. "Mr. Secretary, we've received confirmation that Horizon Development Leadership had direct communication with foreign military entities specifically focused on acquiring regenerative medicine breakthroughs. This has officially become an international security concern." The secretary stood, professional responsibility immediately replacing the brief moment of reflective calm. "I'll need to brief the National Security Council immediately. Mrs. Parker, tomorrow we'll begin implementing the comprehensive protection program for regenerative medicine resources nationwide. Your husband's experience will be invaluable in helping us identify and preserve what remains." As government activity continued through the night, Eleanor finally returned to their bedroom, where James was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the global implications of his body's remarkable capabilities. On his nightstand sat the Silver Star, a medal that had contained microscopic monitoring devices for decades, a physical symbol of sacrifice that had become far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The image captured an unbroken lineage of service and resilience that had nearly ended with foreclosure notices and corporate acquisition. Instead, it would now continue with renewed purpose and recognition. James's patient documentation work finally understood as visionary rather than delusional. What Eleanor Parker couldn't fully appreciate as she drifted towards sleep was how significantly the events unfolding around her humble farm would reshape military medicine worldwide. The farmer's wife, who had been denied a bank loan, would soon become the cornerstone of a fundamental reconsideration of medical value, one that recognized cellular regeneration and biological adaptation as essential security resources rather than impossible anomalies. The secretary's motorcade, arriving at precisely the critical moment, had not only saved a single farm, but launched a national awakening to the true value of biological wisdom that had been systematically undervalued by markets focused solely on standardized protocols and pharmaceutical interventions. The cellular adaptations, preserved through decades of careful documentation, would soon be recognized as irreplaceable national treasures, living libraries of healing developed through one man's cooperation with his body's innate intelligence. As security teams maintain vigilant protection around the Parker farm and its precious biological legacy, the quiet revolution launched by a farmer's wife's stubborn preservation of family land was just beginning to reveal its true significance for humanity's medical future in an increasingly unstable world. As dawn broke the next morning, Eleanor awoke to find James already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with Dr. Johnson, poring over his journals with focused intensity. The confusion and bewilderment that had initially characterized his response to the government presence had transformed into purposeful engagement. "Good morning," he greeted her with newfound energy. "They've found 3 more veterans from my unit who received the experimental treatment. 2 are already in Horizon facilities, but 1 is still independent, living in a retirement community in Arizona. They're sending a team to secure him today." The speed with which James had transitioned from bewildered subject to active participant in the recovery effort spoke volumes about his character. Rather than dwelling on the decades of dismissal by medical authorities or the exploitation attempted by corporate interests, he had immediately focused on how his experience could help others. "Robert Danson," James continued, pointing to a name in his journal. "We corresponded regularly until about 6 months ago when his letters suddenly stopped. His regenerative adaptations focused on neurological recovery, completely different from mine. If Horizon has him, we need to get him back. His capabilities could revolutionize treatment for traumatic brain injuries." Eleanor marveled at her husband's transformation. The burden of secrecy that had weighed on him for decades had lifted, allowing the full measure of his knowledge and insight to emerge. No longer forced to hide his extraordinary healing or downplay his careful documentation, James had stepped fully into his role as perhaps the most important medical research subject in the country. "We've established secure communications with the Arizona team," Dr. Johnson reported. "Thomas Wilkins, the veteran we identified there, has been living under an assumed name for years. He suspected someone was tracking the original treatment recipients and took measures to disappear. His caution may have saved him from Horizon's acquisition efforts." As they discussed recovery strategies for the remaining veterans, Agent Torres entered with her team, their expressions grimly triumphant. "We've completed the preliminary analysis of documents seized from Horizon headquarters," she announced. "The evidence is damning beyond our initial suspicions. Horizon wasn't just acquiring veterans from the experimental program. They were actively suppressing all public research into regenerative medicine that might compete with their proprietary approach." She displayed financial records showing Horizon's subsidiaries had systematically undermined academic research through targeted manipulation of grant funding, strategic acquisition of promising startups, and coordinated campaigns to discredit independent researchers who ventured into regenerative medicine. "They weren't just building a monopoly," Agent Torres explained. "They were actively preventing alternative approaches from developing, especially those based on the body's natural regenerative capabilities rather than their proprietary pharmaceutical interventions." The strategy had been comprehensive and, chillingly, effective. By controlling research funding, patent applications, and regulatory approval processes, Horizon had constructed an invisible barrier around regenerative medicine, ensuring that their approach, based on proprietary drugs rather than enhanced natural healing, would dominate the market when finally revealed. The most disturbing aspect, she continued, is their timeline. According to internal documents, Horizon planned to announce their breakthrough regenerative treatment within 6 months after the last independent veteran from the experimental program had been acquired and removed from public access. James slammed his fist on the table, his normally calm demeanor cracking with rare anger. They were going to claim they invented something that our bodies have been doing naturally for 40 years, all while charging wounded soldiers a fortune for treatment based on capabilities they stole from us. Nui, the moral perversion of the scheme was breathtaking. Horizon had systematically targeted veterans who had volunteered for risky experimental treatments in service to their country, exploited the unique healing capabilities they had developed at great personal cost, and planned to repackage those stolen biological adaptations as corporate innovations while erasing all evidence of their true origins. That's why our farm was so important to them, Eleanor realized. We weren't just collateral damage in a development plan. We were the final loose end in their strategy. Once James was in their facility and our land was bulldozed, there would be no remaining independent evidence of where their breakthrough actually came from. As this understanding settled over the room, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see military vehicles arriving, not the now familiar security teams, but transport vehicles disgorging medical equipment and construction materials. Dr. Morgan entered, her expression energized. The preliminary facility construction has begun. The secretary fast-tracked the authorization process. Within 30 days, your farm will house the first operational center of the National Regenerative Medicine Initiative. The speed of implementation was unprecedented, reflecting the national security implications of what had been discovered. Where government bureaucracy typically moved with glacial deliberation, the recognition of regenerative medicine's strategic importance had catalyzed immediate action. As Eleanor stepped outside to observe the transformation beginning around her family home, she was struck by the profound irony of the situation. The same property that Victoria Carlton had deemed an unacceptable risk just days earlier was now the focus of emergency funding authorizations and expedited construction permits. The land's value hadn't changed, only the recognition of what it represented. "Mrs. Parker," called a voice from the driveway. Eleanor turned to see Victoria Carlton herself, standing awkwardly beside her bank-issued luxury sedan, holding a thick folder and looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Miss Carlton," Eleanor acknowledged coolly, "I believe I requested that you direct all communications to the Treasury Department investigators." The bank manager nodded, her typical corporate confidence notably absent. "I understand, and I've cooperated fully with their inquiries. I'm here on a more personal matter." She hesitated, then continued with unexpected humility. "I was wrong. Not just about your loan application, but about how I've approached my entire role in this community." She extended the folder. "These are the foreclosure proceedings against your farm, now officially withdrawn, along with documentation of similar actions against 7 other family farms in this county over the past 3 years. In each case, the property was subsequently acquired by Horizon subsidiaries." Eleanor accepted the folder without comment, waiting for the banker to continue. "I told myself I was simply following institutional guidelines," Carlton admitted. "But the truth is, I stopped seeing farms as homes and began viewing them solely as underperforming assets. I forgot that metrics on spreadsheets represent people's lives and legacies." The admission was clearly difficult for the career banker, whose professional identity had been built around clinical financial assessments untainted by emotional considerations. "I can't undo the damage to the other families who lost their properties," she concluded, "but I've provided all relevant documentation to the federal investigators, and I've tendered my resignation from National Bank effective immediately. Some mistakes can't be fixed with corporate apologies. As Carlton returned to her vehicle and drove away, Eleanor found herself respecting the woman's accountability, even if it came too late for many families whose generational farms had already been bulldozed for Horizon's expanding empire. The banker's personal reckoning represented a microcosm of the larger awakening beginning to unfold across multiple institutions. The values that had been systematically dismissed as sentimental or irrational, family legacy, natural healing, patient observation, community connection, were being recognized as essential foundations for resilience in an increasingly unstable world. As Eleanor returned to the house, she found James surrounded by military medical officers, each eagerly documenting his insights about cellular regeneration from a veteran's perspective rather than through the lens of traditional medical research. The man whose healing capabilities had been dismissed as impossible by countless doctors was now teaching those with advanced medical degrees about possibilities that existed beyond their textbook understanding. This role reversal, the humble farmer educating Pentagon medical directors, the patient instructing physicians, embodied the fundamental shift occurring around them. Wisdom didn't flow only from institutions to individuals. It often emerged from lived experience, careful observation, and the courage to trust one's own reality even when it contradicted established expertise. As evening approached and construction crews established temporary lighting to continue their work through the night, Eleanor stood with James on their porch, watching their modest farm transform into the foundation for a medical revolution. The land that had been deemed worthless by financial metrics would soon house research facilities developing treatments that no spreadsheet could possibly have valued. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder as they had done for decades of uncertainty and struggle. James considered the question carefully. "Not specifically, no, but I always knew what happened to me was important, that it mattered beyond my own healing. That's why I kept those records even when doctors told me I was imagining things, why I connected with the other veterans when the program was officially abandoned." He gazed across the fields, now illuminated by construction lights, his expression peaceful despite the extraordinary changes unfolding around them. "I just never expected the recognition to come quite so dramatically, or so close to losing everything we've built together." Oji. As they watched the construction teams working with urgent purpose, Eleanor recognized that their family's journey had become something larger than themselves, a symbol of how easily society can overlook transformative value when it appears in unexpected places. The farmer with extraordinary healing, the wife who refused to surrender their land, the daughter who bridged scientific research and family legacy. Together, they had preserved something precious until the world was ready to recognize its importance. The farmer's wife who had walked into a bank, defeated, and emerged to find military vehicles on her property, now stood at the threshold of a new chapter, not just for her family, but for how humanity approached healing itself. The land that financial institutions had dismissed as an unacceptable risk would become the birthplace of medical approaches that might one day save millions of lives, all because one family had the courage to trust what they knew to be true, when every institution told them they were wrong. 5 years had passed since the Secretary of Defense's unexpected arrival at Parker family farm, on that pivotal day when Eleanor had been denied a simple bank loan. The modest family property had transformed into the administrative headquarters of the National Regenerative Medicine Initiative, its once struggling fields now serving as healing gardens, where wounded warriors walked paths to recovery that conventional medicine had once deemed impossible. Eleanor, now 72, stood beneath the soaring glass dome of the newly completed Parker Regenerative Center, where the morning sunlight illuminated interactive displays showcasing the journey from experimental military treatment to revolutionary medical breakthroughs. Visitors from around the world moved slowly through the space, many medical students seeing for the first time the living history their textbooks had only recently begun to include. James would have loved this, observed Michelle, who had become the center's director of integrative research after completing her groundbreaking work, combining cellular regeneration science with traditional healing practices. All those years, he documented his unique healing, while doctors insisted it was impossible. He was preserving the future while everyone thought he was clinging to delusions. Eleanor nodded, watching a group of international medical leaders receive guided explanations of the regenerative techniques her husband had intuitively developed across 4 decades. He always said he wasn't just healing himself. He was mapping possibilities for others. Each journal entry represented a different potential future, adapting to conditions medical science couldn't yet imagine. The wisdom of that perspective had been dramatically validated in the 5 years since Operation Healing Trust began. As global conflicts escalated beyond even pessimistic military projections, the regenerative capabilities preserved by stubborn veterans like James had become the foundation for battlefield medicine worldwide. The cellular adaptations once dismissed as impossible anomalies now provided the blueprint for trauma treatment being deployed across 5 continents. More importantly, the open-source approach established by the national program ensured these critical medical breakthroughs remained publicly accessible rather than locked behind corporate patents. The healing that James and his fellow veterans had experienced would belong to humanity rather than shareholders. Dr. Johnson appeared, tablet in hand, her initial emergency assignment having evolved into permanent leadership of the Regenerative Medicine Initiative. Eleanor, the secretary will be arriving in 20 minutes for the 5th anniversary commemoration. The cabinet meeting will be held in the Heritage Conference Room immediately afterward. Eleanor still found it surreal that cabinet-level government meetings regularly occurred in what had once been her family's barn, now transformed into a state-of-the-art facility where medical policy was developed through unprecedented collaboration between veterans with regenerative experiences and scientific researchers. The international delegation has some significant announcements planned for today, Dr. Johnson continued. 43 nations have now committed to the Regenerative Medicine Accord, establishing protected status for veterans of experimental treatments and creating shared access to cellular adaptation research. This represents a profound shift in how nations approached medical sovereignty. The corporate model of proprietary treatments and patent-protected therapies was giving way to a collaborative framework that recognized trauma recovery as a shared human challenge, transcending national boundaries and commercial interests. Eleanor made her way toward the original farmhouse, preserved exactly as it had been when the secretary's motorcade first arrived. The modest building served as a powerful symbol within the sprawling complex that had grown around it, a reminder that humanity's most valuable medical innovations often emerged not from high-tech laboratories, but from the lived experience of those with the courage to trust their own healing beyond established medical paradigms. The Heritage Cafe adjoining the farmhouse had become a gathering place where scientists and veterans shared meals and knowledge, breaking down the artificial barriers that had long separated lived experience from academic research. Today it bustled with international visitors, medical ministers conversing with veterans of experimental programs, university researchers learning from elderly soldiers whose healing capabilities had been dismissed as impossible just years earlier. Eleanor paused at a wall, displaying photographs of the 31 veterans now protected under the national program. Each represented a unique pathway of regenerative adaptation that had nearly been lost to corporate acquisition and exploitation. diversified foundation of trauma medicine that institutional healthcare had systematically narrowed in pursuit of standardization and pharmaceutical solutions. "There you are," called a familiar voice. Robert Danson, the 79-year-old veteran whose neurological regenerative capabilities had been rescued from a Horizon facility during the initial raids, approached with the cognitive sharpness of a man decades younger. "The brain function trials are showing extraordinary results. James's cellular adaptation techniques, combined with my neuroplasticity pathways, have created something revolutionary." The collaboration between previously isolated veterans had unleashed healing innovations that neither corporate research nor academic medicine had achieved alone. By connecting regenerative pathways that had developed in separate individuals, the program had catalyzed medical breakthroughs precisely when battlefield trauma made them most essential. As Eleanor and Robert discussed their ongoing healing projects, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the secretary's arrival. Though no longer a surprising occurrence at the farm, these visits still carried special significance, particularly on this 5th anniversary of the program that had fundamentally reshaped medical science. Secretary Richards, now serving his second term and widely credited with establishing regenerative medicine as a cornerstone of national security, greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth. Despite the demands of office, he had maintained direct involvement with the initiative, recognizing its critical importance for military readiness in increasingly devastating global conflicts. "Eleanor," he said, clasping her weathered hand, "in both of his 5 years ago today, you showed us what we almost lost through our failure to value intuitive healing wisdom. Today, we celebrate not just what was saved, but what has been created through the reconnection of knowledge systems that should never have been separated." The commemoration ceremony took place in the central courtyard, where Eleanor's family had once gathered for weekend barbecues. Now surrounded by research facilities and treatment centers, the space maintained its connection to human relationships, the foundation upon which scientific innovation could build meaningful healing. Distinguished guests from around the world gathered to mark the program's achievements, the successful integration of over 3,700 unique regenerative adaptations that had faced exploitation, the development of battlefield medical protocols based on veterans' lived experiences, and perhaps most significantly, the emergence of a new medical paradigm that valued innate healing intelligence alongside technological intervention. The secretary spoke with characteristic directness about the program's significance. 5 years ago, our medical system stood at a crossroads. Down one path lay increasing corporatization, standardization, and profit-driven treatment, disguised as innovation. Down the other, the path illuminated by veterans like James Parker, lay the preservation of regenerative possibilities, the diverse cellular foundation necessary for adaptation to traumas we cannot precisely predict. He continued, gesturing toward the veterans displayed on surrounding screens. "We nearly made the catastrophic error of eliminating the very healing capabilities humanity would need for an increasingly violent future. Market systems failed to value regenerative anomalies until crisis made their worth undeniable. What began with a farmer's wife denied a simple bank loan has evolved into a fundamental reconsideration of what constitutes medical value." The international achievements announced that day underscored the global significance of what had begun at Parker Farm. Perhaps most remarkably, Horizon Development's massive biomedical research network, built to monopolize regenerative medicine, had been repurposed as the foundation of a distributed global healing system, ensuring no single corporate entity could control humanity's access to innate healing capabilities. The corporate attempt to monopolize regeneration had instead catalyzed unprecedented international cooperation to preserve it as a shared resource. As formal ceremonies concluded, Eleanor slipped away from the diplomatic proceedings to visit a special section of the farm rarely seen by visitors. Behind the original farmhouse, a simple garden contained plants that James had cultivated during his recovery from various injuries, living embodiments of the healing journey that had nearly vanished beneath developers' bulldozers. Dr. Morgan found her there, kneeling to examine the distinctive herbs her husband had grown to support his remarkable healing process. "The genetic sequencing on James's tissue samples is complete," she reported. "His intuitive adaptation process somehow activated cellular pathways that our most advanced technology is only beginning to understand. Without fancy equipment or pharmaceutical interventions, he recognized healing patterns that still challenge our scientific frameworks." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "He always said the body would tell you what it needed if you listened closely enough. Modern medicine became so focused on controlling symptoms that it stopped paying attention to how tissues naturally regenerate when given the right support. This fundamental insight that healing emerges from relationship rather than intervention had become the philosophical foundation of the new medical paradigm emerging from the regenerative medicine initiative. Rather than forcing broken bodies to recover through increasingly intensive treatments, the focus shifted to supporting innate healing intelligence in cooperative relationship with each unique injury. As afternoon sunlight illuminated the memorial garden, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey from crisis to transformation. The farm that had stood days away from foreclosure and development now served as the administrative center for a global movement reconnecting humanity with its innate healing capabilities. The regenerative adaptations, nearly lost to economic valuation systems that recognized only standardized medical metrics, now anchored trauma recovery strategies on every continent. What had begun with the humiliation of loan denial, followed by the shock of a military motorcade, had evolved into something far more profound, a fundamental reconsideration of medical wisdom and value that transcended normal political and economic boundaries. Later that evening, after the dignitaries departed and the farmhouse quieted, Eleanor sat with Michelle and her 25-year-old son Matthew on the same porch where 4 generations of Parkers had contemplated their fields. Matthew, now studying regenerative medicine while maintaining deep involvement with the practical healing work pioneered by his grandfather, represented the perfect integration of lived experience and modern science that had become the hallmark of the new approach. "Grandma," Matthew asked, reviewing data on his tablet from their latest regenerative trials, "why do you think it took a crisis for people to recognize the value of what Grandpa preserved?" "The evidence was there all along that cellular regeneration would be crucial for trauma medicine." Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. "Human systems struggle to value what they haven't yet needed. Your grandfather used to say that true healing often appears indistinguishable from impossible recovery until circumstances change enough to reveal its wisdom." Michelle added, "Institutional systems optimized for standardized treatments inevitably undervalue adaptations they haven't classified. Medical markets couldn't price regenerative capabilities until battlefield injuries made their worth undeniable." The conversation paused as they watched the sun setting over experimental gardens where scientists and veterans worked side by side, combining decades of lived healing wisdom with advanced analytical tools. The artificial boundaries that had separated these knowledge systems were dissolving, revealing them as complementary approaches to the same fundamental challenge, restoring wholeness in a world of increasing fragmentation. "The real tragedy," Eleanor reflected, "isn't that we almost lost this farm. It's how many similar healing treasures were lost before anyone recognized their value. How many veterans with unique regenerative capabilities were dismissed by medical systems? How many intuitive healing pathways developed through decades of personal recovery disappeared into corporate research facilities where the originators received neither credit nor compensation? This sobering reality had driven the initiative's urgency, the recognition that each lost regenerative adaptation represented not merely a medical anomaly, but an irreplaceable healing pathway developed through decades of relationship between human resilience and biological intelligence. Every veteran whose unique capabilities were exploited by corporate interests, every intuitive healer whose methods were dismissed as unscientific, eliminated possibilities humanity might desperately need in an increasingly violent future. Yet the program's achievements over 5 years demonstrated that recognition, even belated, could catalyze extraordinary preservation and innovation. The medical paradigm shift launched from Parker Farm had spread globally with remarkable speed, transcending normal institutional resistance to fundamental change. Perhaps because trauma touches such basic human needs, the necessity for regenerative approaches had overcome traditional medical and economic divisions. As darkness settled over the farm, lights illuminated the research facilities and treatment centers that now surrounded the original farmhouse. Security remained tight. The regenerative capabilities preserved here still represented irreplaceable resources that could determine survival rates in an unstable future. But the atmosphere had transformed from emergency response to purposeful mission. Tomorrow, the Philippine delegation wants to discuss integrating their traditional bone-setting techniques with our fracture regeneration protocols. Matthew noted, reviewing the next day's schedule. Their indigenous healers have been accelerating skeletal recovery for centuries. The methods they've developed could be crucial as similar injuries become more common in modern conflicts. This exchange exemplified the initiative's core philosophy, that humanity's best hope for trauma recovery lay not in centralized technological solutions, but in connecting diverse healing systems developed through generations of careful observation and lived experience. The program had established formal frameworks valuing intuitive healing knowledge as equal to academic medicine, creating unprecedented collaboration between healers previously separated by artificial hierarchies of credibility. As they prepared to retire for the night, Eleanor took a final walk to the hillcrest overlooking the property. The modest farm that had nearly vanished beneath commercial development had become the nucleus of a profound transformation in how humanity approached its relationship with trauma and the living systems that restore wholeness. The farmer's wife, denied a bank loan that pivotal morning, now regularly advised generals and prime ministers on regenerative medicine strategies for an increasingly violent world. Most significantly, the wisdom her husband had preserved when it seemed medically impossible, maintaining detailed records of healing that defied conventional explanation, trusting his body's innate intelligence rather than surrendering to statistical prognoses, had been validated not as delusional optimism, but as essential foresight. What financial institutions had deemed worthless and developers had valued only for underlying land had proven to be perhaps the most valuable medical resource of the coming century, the biological foundation for recovery from conditions that standardized treatments could not address. As Eleanor gazed across the darkened fields where security patrols now protected healing knowledge once deemed medically impossible, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from crisis to transformation. The secretary's motorcade arriving, at precisely the critical moment 5 years earlier, had not only saved her family's heritage, but launched a fundamental reconsideration of medical value with implications for humanity's shared future. The farmer's wife, who had walked into a bank defeated and emerged to find military vehicles on her property, had become the catalyst for a new medical wisdom that recognized regenerative diversity and adaptation as essential rather than impossible. Her family's decades of careful documentation, preserved against all institutional skepticism, now served as the foundation for trauma recovery in an increasingly violent world, proving that the most valuable innovation often emerges not from disrupting tradition, but from preserving it until changing conditions reveal its hidden wisdom. As Eleanor made her final rounds through the property that evening, she paused at the memorial garden dedicated to James, who had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier. Unlike conventional memorials focused on loss, this living space celebrated continuation, each plant cultivated from those he had grown during his remarkable healing journey, each pathway designed to reflect his understanding of recovery as a process of remembering wholeness rather than fighting disease. The small plaque at the garden's entrance bore his most frequent advice to fellow veterans: "Your body remembers its blueprint. Your task is not to force healing, but to create the conditions where remembering becomes possible." This profound insight that regeneration emerges from relationship rather than intervention had transformed from one veteran's personal philosophy into the cornerstone of a global medical revolution. What had once been dismissed as unscientific optimism now anchored treatment protocols that had demonstrably saved thousands of lives on battlefields across the world. As stars appeared in the clear night sky, Eleanor sat on the simple bench at the garden's center, surrounded by the living legacy of her husband's healing journey. The farm that financial institutions had valued only for its development potential now housed wisdom more precious than any office complex or distribution center could have provided: the irreplaceable knowledge of how human bodies remember wholeness even after catastrophic injury. "You were right all along," she whispered to James's memory. "The body does know its way home if we trust its wisdom." In the distance, lights still burned in the research facilities where scientists and veterans continued their collaborative work late into the night, racing to preserve and expand regenerative capabilities before the next global crisis made them even more essential. The mission that had begun with one family's stubborn refusal to surrender their land had expanded into a worldwide movement, reconnecting humanity with its innate healing potential. As Eleanor finally made her way back to the farmhouse, still, her home, despite the extraordinary transformation around it, she passed the small office where it had all begun. The bank's foreclosure notice, now preserved under glass as a historical artifact, hung beside the executive order establishing the National Regenerative Medicine Initiative. The juxtaposition of these documents, one declaring her family's land worthless by financial metrics, the other recognizing it as invaluable to national security, provided perhaps the most powerful testimony to how profoundly valuation systems could fail when measuring only what markets currently recognized, rather than what humanity might eventually need. What financial institutions had dismissed as an unacceptable risk had become the cornerstone of medical security for an increasingly wounded world. The farmer's wife, who couldn't secure a simple operating loan, had become the guardian of healing, wisdom that transcended price. The veteran, once ridiculed for claiming impossible recovery, had pioneered pathways now saving lives daily in conflict zones worldwide. As Eleanor settled into her favorite chair on the porch for one final moment of reflection before bed, she watched the security teams making their rounds, protecting the irreplaceable knowledge preserved here. The modest farm that had almost slipped away had instead become the birthplace of a medical revolution, all because one family refused to accept that healing must follow institutional expectations or conventional timelines. The truth that had emerged from their struggle now illuminated recovery pathways for wounded warriors across the globe. The body remembers wholeness even when medicine has forgotten how to listen. This wisdom, preserved against all financial logic and institutional skepticism, would guide trauma medicine for generations to come, long after the foreclosure notices and bank rejections had faded into distant memory. What remained was the living legacy of trusting innate healing beyond statistical prognosis, a legacy now flourishing in gardens of recovery where the impossible happened daily, just as James Parker had documented in journals once dismissed as delusions and now studied as revolutionary medical texts. The farmer's wife denied a loan had preserved something beyond price, not just land, but wisdom, not just a family home, but humanity's birthright to regeneration when conventional approaches offer only management of decline. The journey from crisis to transformation had revealed a truth that would guide medicine for generations to come. Healing is not what we do to the body, but what we allow the body to remember about its own inherent wholeness. As night deepened over Parker Farm, now the Parker Regenerative Center, Eleanor finally understood the full measure of what their struggle had preserved. Not merely a family legacy, but humanity's path back to wholeness in an increasingly broken world. Up next, you've got two more remarkable stories right on your screen. If this one touched your heart, you won't want to miss these. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.